Now we're going to attempt something which is a little bit, what should we say, optimistic this evening. I want us to look at this whole chapter. I don't normally do that, but sometimes it's good for us to get an overview of what it is that's being said. We can dive at times into the minutiae, the detail, which is good, but sometimes we just need to step back and see the whole wood and not just a single tree. So that's what I want us to attempt this evening. I need to say at the outset that this might be a rocky ride. Okay, so fasten your seatbelts. Now let me ask you a question. Have you ever been stopped from doing something that you were really desperate to achieve? You wanted to do this thing, you really, you'd been thinking about it, planning it, longing for it for some time, but somehow everything seemed to conspire against you and it got in your way and you couldn't do it. When things like this happen, we get immensely frustrated. And sometimes we're tempted to sulk. But the Apostle Paul wasn't like that. Instead, it drove the Apostle Paul to creativity. He desperately wanted to go to Rome. He desperately wanted to see the people in Rome, the Christians who lived there. He'd never been there before. He wanted to go, but somehow it just didn't happen. And so he thought, well, there must be some other way that I can communicate with them. And that is the thing that drove him to put pen to paper and to write this letter that we have. A letter that we are reading 2,000 years after he wrote it, which is, I still find stunning. It's amazing. But the letter is wonderful. The letter is a careful, methodical, closely argued presentation of the good news of Jesus Christ, the gospel. And not only the good news, but the ramifications of the good news. What does this mean? How should this work out in the life of the church? And how should it be interpreted as we view the world around us? Now, the first section of the letter begins, the first main section begins at verse 18 of chapter 1 and continues through until verse 20 of chapter 3. Now, we're not going to cover all of that, honest, okay, just to allay your fears. But verse 20 of chapter 3 ends with these words. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. And he continues and says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And that's really the end of that section. What he's doing in this opening section of the book is he is establishing the universality of sin and the condemnation that comes upon sin. He is doing so that everyone, no matter what their background, can see that they need the gospel. They need the good news. In chapter 2, he focuses in particular on his own people, the Jews, and shows their need. But in chapter 1, he deals with the non-Jews, the Gentile world. And by Gentile world, sometimes he uses the word Gentile, sometimes he uses the word Greek. He has the idea of everybody who is not a Jew. So that may include true Greeks. It may include people from China who were into Confucianism. It may include animists. It may include pantheists. It may include pagans. It may include atheists. Everybody is, if you like, packed together in this phrase or in this word, Gentile. And it means that there is no limitation. Paul is not limited in his thinking to one particular geographical location, Rome. He is not limited in his thinking to one particular generation, first century Roman Empire. He's not limited in that way. His context may have been that, but as we begin to read what he says, we can see that this actually applies to 21st century Britain and 21st century Western world. So it's not limited. It's not limited to his own day and generation and location. It's got a much bigger reach, a timelessness about it. He begins by saying in verse 18 that God is revealing something. And he says God is revealing something now. Notice what he says. The wrath of God is revealed. It's now. It's present tense. It is ongoing, the revelation that comes from God. Now notice he's ended his previous introductory section by also talking about God revealing something. For therein, that's in the gospel, is the righteousness of God revealed. God reveals something in the good news. But before we can really understand that, we need to understand what else God is revealing. What is he revealing? He uses the word wrath. What does that mean? He's saying that God is letting us know of his holy revulsion, his indignation, his settled opposition to everything that contradicts his holiness. And Paul is saying that God is making this visible. He's saying God is doing something dynamically, that God is doing something operationally that can be seen in the world with our own two eyes. God is showing us something that we can see. What he then goes on to do is to describe what God is revealing. And I want us to consider this under three headings. The first is the stages or steps of decline. The stages or steps of decline. Because what Paul then goes on to do from verse 18 down to the end of the chapter is to chart the decline of a civilization. Now, clearly, his immediate context is the Roman Empire and its decline. But it's not limited to the Roman Empire, because the things that were at work in the Roman Empire were exactly the same things that were at work in the Babylonian Empire and in the Greek Empire and in the Medo-Persian Empire and in all previous empires. They all went the same way. And Paul says there are three very distinct steps in this decline. And each of those steps is preceded by a particular phrase that he repeats. It's in verse 24. God also gave them up. Verse 26, God gave them up. Verse 28, God gave them over. What does this tell us? Paul is not saying that God stopped interfering. It's much bigger than that. He's saying that God has a very deliberate act. He does something deliberate. He acts in wrath. He consigns, he abandons to, he removes constraint. That's the idea behind these words, gave up. So he removes constraints that in normal circumstances would act within a civilization to prevent subversive behaviour. God takes those restraints away. He gives them up. Now, how does that work out? There are 3 steps. They're in verse 24, 26 and 28. First step. A revolution of sex. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonour their own bodies between themselves. God removes the constraints to moral uncleanness. And this is driven along in practical terms by lust and results in dishonouring of bodies. He clearly has in mind sexual sin. It's not that there was no sexual sin before, but now God has taken away the restraints. God has given them up to it. God has abandoned them to it. All the accepted norms that sex is something wonderful to be enjoyed within the context of marriage are jettisoned. Now, you don't need to be a kind of super academic to work out that since the Second World War, that is exactly what has happened in Britain. In the 50s, 60s and 70s, the UK attitude to sex has undergone a revolution. Marriage, which used to be the thing that kind of cemented society together, well, that's really very low down the agenda now. Cohabitation is the thing. It used to be called shacking up. The Bible calls it fornication. And our children are being taught in school that sex is to be explored. Sex is to be experimented with. And this whole thing has been driven along by music, by the tabloid newspapers, by the soap operas. And now we have a sex free-for-all. And in order to deal with the consequences of that, well, we have to do some other things as well that go along with it. We have to promote contraception. We have to support abortion. And what we've ended up with is a war between women and men. The radical feminist movement has emerged from this. And a war between women and their babies. Family life, family relationships have become so knotted, they're like a pan of spaghetti. What is this? God gave them up. He handed them over to it. That's what he's done to us. My dear friend, open your eyes and see the revelation of the wrath of God. That's the first stage. Step 2, in verse 26, not just a revolution of sex, but a revolution of sexuality. For this cause, God gave them up to vile affections, For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature, and likewise also their men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. What's Paul saying? The next stage of God's abandonment is this: vile passions, dishonouring themselves in disgraceful behaviour. It's interesting that he turns first to lesbianism in verse 26. And he uses the word even. And he's kind of implying that there is something even more degrading about lesbianism than there is about homosexuality between men. But both are unnatural, and both stem from a burning, insatiable lust that has no legitimate outlet. Again, you don't have to be a genius to work out that, well, the 1980s, 90s and noughties has seen an explosion in this area in Britain. An explosion in an acceptance of this behaviour in Britain, forced along by campaigning groups like Stonewall and by the gay pride movement. Now, of course, it's not that these things weren't there before. Those people of our generation remember the scandal around Jeremy Thorpe. But all restraints are now gone. God has removed them. God has handed us over to this moral squalor. God gave them up. My dear friend, open your eyes to our generation and see God is at work in our generation, in Britain. God is giving us up. He's handing us over. That's the second step. But there is a third step, and it's in verse 28. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, or a mind void of judgment. I've called this a revolution of sense. The mind is the seat of thinking. The mind is the place of reason. And Paul is saying that God removes restraint so that men and women can no longer think straight. They no longer reason logically. They no longer say things that are sensible, but they say things that are completely mad. And you can see this now beginning to work out in the teenties in our day. You see, the same people who are arguing that it's morally repugnant to have capital punishment for those guilty of the most vile and despicable and degrading crimes are the very same people who are arguing that it's morally justifiable to kill the innocent unborn. What is this? It's madness. And at the same time, you have people arguing that our children should be taught they can be any sex they want, and sex is not determined by their chromosomes. And at the same time, if you help children to understand who they really are, that should be outlawed. This is total madness. This is the reprobate mind. This is the mind void of understanding. God has given us up to madness. Listen, my friends, God is at work in Britain today. He's giving us up and he's revealing his wrath. And what's the consequence of that? Well, the things that he lists in verse 29, 30, 31 and 32. What does he say? Being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God. Stop, you say, stop. No, he won't stop. Despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which do such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but they enjoy watching it on the telly. This is a tsunami, an avalanche of evil. And of course, there are some in our society who are rejoicing in this moral anarchy. But what is this? This is the revelation that God wants you to see of his wrath. The question is, how did we get here? The question is, what was it that induced God to respond in this way to post-Second World War Britain? So we've seen the stages or steps of decline. Second thing we need to see is the seeds of decline. Because Paul, in introducing these three phrases, God gave them up, he is clearly presenting that action of God as a response to something. Each of those three things are a response to something that went before. If you like, the action of man induces a reaction from God. So, what were the actions of men and women that drove God to respond in this way? First, let's go back then to before verse 24. Verses 19 to 23. The first action is repudiating the revelation of God. Repudiating it, saying we are not taking any notice of what God is revealing. You see, Paul is making it clear in these verses that God can be known. God isn't hiding away, saying, these people can't know me. No. God wants to be known. And God can be known. And he is active in revealing himself. In fact, he reveals things to men and women that actually are invisible things. That's amazing, isn't it? God takes invisible things about his character and he reveals them. He reveals his eternal power. He reveals his divine status. How does he do that? Well, he does it in the natural world. We look out on the natural world and there are things of great power. And in it, God is revealing his power, through whom those things came into existence. We look into the natural world and we see its vastness. And through that we understand the vastness of God. Solomon said, even the heaven of heavens cannot contain him. We look out on the natural world and we see just incredible beauty. I drove up here this morning. The sky was blue, and I came up past the turning for the Sahawi Valley Walk. I'm just coming into Wattsville, and there's a lone tree on the hillside, and the bracken has turned orange-yellow, and the blue sky behind. It was stunning. I wish I'd had a camera, but I didn't have time anyway. But if I had one, I'd have been snapping away. Beauty. And what does that tell us? It tells us something of the beauty of God. God is beautiful. And the more we understand about the natural world, and our generation knows more about it than any previous generation, the more we understand, the more God intends us to discover about himself. Those verses that we began with. The works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. Do you know why those words are famous? They're etched in stone above the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge University, over the door. Anyone who knows God looks at creation and says, whoa, God is great. Now I can see it. It's wonderful. And that's why, on a personal note, physiology is the best thing. Because it's studying God's greatest creation. Studying how men and women actually work. But we didn't want that knowledge. We weren't going to listen. We didn't want to give God the credit. We didn't want to be thankful to God. We were deeply ungrateful to God. And so we've ended up in a situation where the more we know, the less credit we give to God. The more we understand, the less we perceive of God. We can be academically brilliant and spiritually dumb. And it seems that the more we know, the more we understand, the more determined we are to believe that somehow all of this made itself. And we come up with more and more fanciful, gormless interpretations of what we see in order to back up our belief that somehow the world made itself. God has been creating. And in that creation we see him, we understand him, we learn about him, we know of him. But in our madness, we've turned that into chance, time, and natural selection. How does God respond to that? He hands them over to a sexual revolution. What about the second stage? What's God reacting to there? Well, it's there in verse 25. Who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator who is blessed forever. In a way, this is obvious progression from what has preceded it. Because here we have replacing God as the object of worship. Now, in a way, it kind of makes logical sense. If God didn't make us, well, there's no point in worshipping him. And the mid-20th century has seen mass abandoning of God and of Jesus Christ. Again, you don't have to be a genius to work this out. Look at all the empty chapels. where once the praises of God resounded and reverberated inside, and now they're derelict, or their residences, or their shops, or cinemas, or something else. But of course, men and women are at their heart worshipping beings. So you can't just throw God out and not worship anything. So you worship something, as long as it's not God. And we saw, didn't we, in the 60s and 70s, this turning towards Eastern religion. We saw the acceptance of yoga and meditation and Tai Chi and Islam and witchcraft and Halloween, the devil's Christmas, and even Satanism. Satanism in Britain. And how does God respond? He hands them over to a revolution of sexuality. But what about the third phase? What's God responding to there? Well, it's there in verse 28. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind. They wanted to obliterate from their minds every thought of God. God must go. We are not thinking about him. We're not giving him a moment. He's not fit for our thinking. He's not fit for purpose. He must be expunged from our brains. God must have no place in the public square. He must never be exposed to our children. They must not know anything about him. Our parents would rather take their kids to football, rugby, judo, anything apart from Sunday school. Don't want God. God must never influence our decision making or our policy making, and he definitely must not trouble our consciences. And how does God respond to this humanist charter? He gave them over to a reprobate mind. So, Tim, please stop. This is so dismal. Yeah, it is. It's dismal. We're on a downward spiral in Britain, sinking lower and lower and lower. And this is God at work. This is his wrath revealed. And when we think about it, our hearts sink into our boots. And we say, there's just no hope for us. What a hopeless mess we're in. Is that what Paul wanted you to think? No. He did want you to see it, and so does God, because God's revealing it. But God doesn't want you to stop there. Why does God reveal this? Because he wants you to grasp the answer to the decline. Because there is an answer. What's the remedy? If everyone, which is Paul's argument, if everyone is guilty, if everyone has sinned, and our generation has sinned more than many that went before it, with all of the knowledge that we have, what hope is there? What's the answer? We're only in chapter 1. The answer is chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 and 16. That's the answer. But we're not going to read all that. Fortunately, it's summarised for us. It's summarised in verses 15, 16 and 17. So as much as in me is, says Paul, I am ready to preach the gospel. To you that are at Rome also, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek, for therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. The answer to 21st century Britain in all its mess, and America, and France, and Germany, and Spain, and Italy, and Australia, and New Zealand, wherever you care to look, where this thing is happening, the answer is the gospel. The good news about Jesus Christ. That's the answer. There are three things here, just very briefly. First of all, gospel preaching. Gospel preaching. Now, of course, the context is Paul thinking about the Roman Empire. And he knows that the answer for the Roman Empire is the gospel. And you see in him his readiness. He says, I'm ready. I'm ready. It's almost as if he's got his shoes done up, he's got his coat on, he's got his bag over his shoulder, he's got his staff in his hand. He's ready. He's got his Bible under his arm. He's ready. He's ready. He's even ready to go to Rome, to the lion's den, and to share the gospel. But notice what he wants to do. He says, I'm ready to preach the gospel. He has no intention of going to Rome to entertain the people. He's got no intention of going there to carry out some sort of medieval drama. He's got no intention of going there to put on a West End show. He's got no intention of going there to bring some clever philosophical argument. No. He wants to go there to preach, to declare, to trumpet this message. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners. That's it. But it's not just preaching. Notice what he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. Not ashamed. You see, Paul is not apologetic about the gospel. He knows many in his generation think the gospel the dumbest thing on earth. But he's not going to let that worry him. He's not ashamed of it. He knows that many of his fellow countrymen think the gospel is the most ridiculous, weak thing on earth. But he's not ashamed. He's not going to backpedal or soft pedal because he thinks some people are going to be offended by this message. I'm not ashamed, he says. I'm not ashamed of this gospel. This good news. Gospel preaching. That's what he's about. And if you're a preacher, you be about gospel preaching. Because that's the answer to our generation. Next, gospel power. He says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation. The power. You see, Paul knew from his own personal experience just how transformational this gospel is. The gospel isn't some inadequate self-help scheme. No. The gospel is God's dynamite. It's God's power. It's divine power bottled up in this good news. The gospel contains power to arrest people on the road to hell. It contains power to enliven the conscience, to make it come back to life. It contains power to reveal God and Jesus Christ. It contains power to bring someone who is dead in sin to the new birth. It contains power to bring someone to new life in Jesus. It contains power to expunge the record of sin. It contains power to make righteous in God's sight. It contains power to reconcile someone who is far off from God and to bring them back and to reunite them with God. It contains power to keep the Christian from the moment he's saved to the moment he enters heaven. The gospel. He says, I know, it's full of power. That's why I'm not ashamed of it. And that's the answer for our generation. The gospel of power. But notice, thirdly, gospel people. Who's this gospel for? Who is it working? Who is it effective for? What does he say? To everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. He says it works for my fellow countrymen, Jewish people who've been brought up in religion. It works for them. Greeks, people brought up with no religion or some crazy religion. It works for them. Power. And it works for everyone who believes. They may start out life as a monotheist or a pantheist or an atheist or some other theist. But for all of them, once they believe the gospel, this power comes to them and starts to work in them. Listen, our generation is in a mess. The answer, the gospel. The gospel. Christian, have you seen it? Have you seen just how bad a mess we're in? And that this is actually the outworking of the wrath of God. What do we do? Christian, our only hope is the gospel. Stop ducking and diving. Stop bobbing and weaving. Stop blushing about the gospel. Be ready. Be ready to give an answer for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. Be ready with the gospel. But maybe you're not a Christian. My dear friend, open your eyes. Look, see. God is revealing something in our generation. God is working in our day. It's here. God is showing us something about himself and what he does. And what does this mean for you? Well, if you're part of this great mass of humanity who is travelling down the road away from God towards hell, wake up, my friend, wake up before it's too late. Don't keep going that way. In the gospel, you are invited to turn round and to embrace Jesus Christ, because he and he alone can transform you and can put you on that narrow road that leads to life. I invite you this evening to come to Jesus Christ, because he is the one we all need. Come to him. He says, come unto me. Come, he said, come to me. All you that labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. He says, whoever comes to me, I will in no wise cast out. There's no circumstances I can foresee, says Jesus, where I'm going to turn you away. You come to me. You come to me. He says he'll give rest for your soul. You come to him. Find rest for your soul. I invite you. Jesus invites you. Paul wants you to know this is the answer. That's what Scripture's about. I urge you to come to Jesus Christ and find in him peace and salvation and reconciliation with God.